Mine still busy with Unit 3, Covenant at Mount Sinai. And here we're just trying to understand Israel's responsibility to the covenant God made with her and the importance of the covenant relationship in the life of the nation. Okay, so the 6 chapters of this lesson introduces a block of material which extends through the remainder of the book of Exodus, embraces all of Leviticus, and includes the first 10 chapters of Numbers. You'll find out after repeating the Pentateuch, but it will have different applications sometimes in the life of the Israelites. Please note, what I'm giving you tonight is not a detailed study of the law. Okay? However, the history of Israel cannot be understood fully apart from knowing something about the law and the covenant. In fact, you will struggle to fully understand the New Testament if you don't deal with this here. We'll do a full study on it. Exodus 19 to 24, Genesis 3 are the most important sections of the Old Testament. Why? Because it deals with the fall and then God's plan to redeem man. Exodus 19 to 24 sets for the covenant, and Israel accepted his promises and his responsibilities. The covenant relationship was established between God and his chosen people. Remember, they are the elect. Like we are the elect. Here to he elects. But the only difference here, the beauty here is how he moves them into a relationship. Ours is a bit different when it comes to that. We have this history of how he moves them in. Note, the covenant relationship was established between God and his people. Israelites is never coerced. They actually would, like a lover goes after somebody and attacks them and allures them. He allures them with his blessings that he bestows on them before he actually tells them, but I'm interested in you. Soos 'n gift wat jy al die hele jou boyfriend, jou future boyfriend is vir jou die hele tyd aanstuur. So praat die hele tyd met hom, maar sy blessings is veel groter as dit. So daar is eintlik 'n comparison nie. Yahweh delivered them from Egypt, and that was the first blessing from Egyptian bondage, and promised to make them a great nation with their own land. So he keeps on reminding them of what he did. He spoke through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The adoption meant the acceptance of the law received at Sinai. So just when a child is adopted, brought into the home, he comes under the rules of the home. Because as the nation would be ruled by God and his will. And that is no different for us. Abrahamic covenant, the descendants of Abraham would be blessed. But the second part of that was that other nations would be blessed. When they saw how God worked with them, how he showed himself, his character, his nature to them, through miracles, through the blessings of land, they too would be blessed in turn if they walked a road of obedience. Remember, you will only see the blessing if there's obedience. The two goes hand in hand. They are not separate from each other. Yahweh is concerned with being honored and worshipped by all men. He received the due recognition for what he had done for Israel, but more so because he is the possessor of heaven and earth. And that is actually the most important reason there. Everything here belongs to the Lord. Yes, they are God's chosen people. Before them, he created the heavens and the earth. This little ball of his, remember the psalm says, the earth is his footstool. Israel is called to be a holy people, just like us. No different. We are called to be holy people. We are called to show forth the glory of God. They belong to God, we belong to God, with the responsibility of bringing the nations of the world into proper relationship with their Creator. You see the similarities between the covenants. There is slight differences. There's also similarities, because we also said, go and make disciples of all nations. Remember always that the covenant includes two parts. There's the responsibilities and there is the blessings. Responsibility first is to serve Him, to obey His law, to show forth His glory. And in turn He blesses them. But the blessings also relates to His salvation. After journeying 3 months, Israel camps before Mount Sinai, and yearly they receive the covenant. And they were to prepare for the 3 days for the divine appearance of God, and they to consecrate themselves. And you often see this consecration thing when we know we are now going to step into His will, into the blessing. We'll also see it, Jacob, when he leaves Laban, after they move out, when he realizes, listen, but I have a responsibility now. He says to his family, come, clean up. Let's get the gods out. And those gods that they took with them, remember? And they had to get rid of all of that stuff. It was the consecration. The presence of God was so awesome and overwhelming that the people were to avoid intimate familiarity, which might be expressed by coming too near to the mountain. Now, often God appeared in the Old Testament, and that is called a theophany. A theophany is merely the appearance of God to men, but He doesn't necessarily, it's not the actual form of God, remember? No one can see God. Even Moses had to turn his back. God just passed by him, so what he saw was the reflection of God, the glory of God. The presence of God was manifested through thunder, lightning, and a thick cloud upon the mountain. And often you'll find in the scriptures the same thing happens. If you look at the picture of Isaiah too, there's the shaking of the pillars, there's the temple being filled with smoke. Moses led the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And the presence of the Lord is explained in terms of fire and smoke. Including here we have the sound of the trumpet, which signifies the presence or advent of God, and also acted as a summons calling the people to attention. We have the establishment of the covenant, and that's in Exodus 20, verses 1 to 21. And God spoke all His words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. The 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son, or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. And therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, nor shall you covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning, and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off, and said to Moses, You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Here you see for the first time the response. He wooed them in first. Like I said, here it says the reason for Israel's entering into the covenant relationship was to show the people's gratitude to God. So there's the first response. Blessing and obedience is inseparable. If you read Deuteronomy, I think it's from 28 onwards, you will find both the blessings and the curses. And it is very clear what happens when you obey. It is very clear when you disobey what will follow. I think of my younger brother. He was a Christian for a while, and then he fell back again. And I spoke to him and I said to him, Guy, you're taking a fat chance. And so I read to him the curses. I read it to him. And he followed. Even he did not want to listen. Because with the curses, at the bottom end, it says but if you turn. God always makes provision if you turn. Because he sees the heart. If the heart turns, he responds. I think you know the song, Trust and Obey. To be happy in Jesus is to trust and obey. This in Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 5:4, we have God speaking, actually saying to Moses, this is my word to the people. Then in Deuteronomy 4:13, 10, 4, Exodus 21, it says God wrote. So the terms is not necessarily the physical writing. Deuteronomy 5:22 says God first spoke, then wrote. The significance of the covenant maker's name is also expressed in 20 verse 2. He is both the deliverer and the lawgiver. That we need to keep in mind always. Okay, let's go to the commandments. The first commandment sets forth what we call practical monotheism, by not denying the existence of other gods, but prohibits Israel's worship of other gods in place of Yahweh. Remember, Abraham came out of a town that had other gods. So they were aware that other gods existed. But they never understood that there was only one. And this is what God had to make. This is the journey of the patriarchs, through to Joseph, through to Moses, who must learn to understand that there is only one. Because I think remember that they attribute certain powers to these gods of theirs. And so when they see things happen or what we would possibly coincidence or not coincidence, then they would ascribe that to them as well. So they had to rid themselves of all of that. That it wasn't these gods that was showing themselves. It was the only wise God that was doing that. So they had to understand that there was only one. Actually, according to this, no other God existed but God. It says in the beginning, God. That's how the Pentateuch is written. That's why the first verse is so important. In the beginning, God. There's no peer there. There's no equal something there. There's no other measure that you can put next to that verse. It says in the beginning, God. More importantly, it also made known to them that He was the creator God. That He was the responsible one for putting together this beautiful earth and the planets and the moon and the stars. Second commandment, Israel was prohibited from making images of God to use in worship. Now, in the Hebrew mind, those two verses seem to be interrelated, so they actually throw them together. We separate them. But that's only when you get into the, I think here from the 15th century onwards, you have them starting to split this up into two parts rather than the one. Israel was prohibited from making images of a god to use in worship. Neither his presence nor his power could be contained or controlled in an image. The problem in using helps in worship is that the symbol usually becomes the object of worship. Like for example in the Catholic home, you will find a lot of these. Jy net een van daai goed af. You're going to anger that person because they give so much value to that thing. And then that's the problem. That becomes the object of worship. The third commandment, the name represents the person and is not to be used for any unreal or frivolous purpose, for perjury and false oaths, or for private purposes of gain or magical control. To define his name is to degrade his character. In other words, in our finite minds, we sometimes try to understand God and try to describe Him, to try to define Him. We should never do that because He can't be contained. He's incomparable. We are finite. He's infinite. We are finite. His thoughts is higher than our thoughts. There's no way we can comprehend what is infinite. To define his name, I said, degrades his character, and the misuse of his name is an offense against God's holiness. The fourth commandment, God sets an example for keeping the seventh day by creating on 6 days and resting on the seventh. Sabbath means to cease from, which is a period of rest. If you go to the book of Hebrews, you'll also find that they talk about the same thing, of the rest that is to come. Remember, in Christ there is the peace that we may experience, the peace of God. But the final rest is when He returns and it's complete. All of history is culminated in His return. The Sabbath was reserved as a festival day where sacrifices were to be offered and where all of man and beast ceased from labor. The fifth commandment. Now the 10 commandments is divided into 2 groups. The first 4, important, set forth duties to God, and the last 5 sets forth duties to your neighbor. The 5th commandment deals with relationship to parents, and I actually I had to sit a little still and reread this thing over and over again because we make little of that verse and it means so much. It serves as a link between the 4 that relate to God and the 5 that relate to its neighbor. But more importantly, it also places the importance of parents almost next to God. Why? Because my relationship with my mother and father might also be a very real reflection of my relationship with God. Family life, it establishes the patterns for personal life. That was a very profound statement what is right now. Very profound. Dit wat in die huis gebeur, gaan by die kan gebeur. Dit wat hulle daar doen, is so goed soos uitgemaak, die saak dit was in die huis gebeur. Nie altyd nie, as kinders besluit om keer te loop, maar meerendeels, en die sê ons die tuinlijke child, die wees, you will never forget it. You will never forget what you taught it. The 6th commandment prohibits murder, apart from capital punishment and defensive war. Other scriptures permit capital punishment, defensive war, and killing. Now, you might have to do with what we call euthanasia. That is also something that comes into play here, obviously, which has been a heavy debate in South Africa over the last couple of years, which people have been going to court concerning the matter of euthanasia. I suppose if I'm not in that position of a family member, I can't really comprehend or understand what they're going through. The only problem then is it becomes an emotional response. And that's where the argument sometimes falls flat. It's an emotional response. because of what you're feeling for this person and the sympathy that comes with the person suffering at that time. We can't go into it, there's a long debate. Seventh commandment, the sanctity of marriage is upheld, and the husband and wife alike is warned against infidelity, which receives the death penalty. You'll see in the New Testament, if you go to Mark 10, in Corinthians as well, but Mark 10 was an interesting reading for me. Let me just go over it quickly. Teaching about divorce. Remember, divorce was permitted, apparently. But here's the thing. Was it really allowed? According to God's law, you could not get divorced. But it's permitted, and that's the difference. According to the law, the Ten Commandments, it's not allowed at all. So who permits it? And he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond Jordan. The crowds gathered to him, and again, as was his custom to him, the Pharisees came up, and in order to test him, asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" Do you see how they pose the question? Is it lawful? Not is it permitted, is it lawful? He answers them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away." And Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." Nou, ek is nou nie so hard nie, dat ek nie vir jou sal sê dat indien jou lewe gevaar is, dat jy nie moet uitloop nie. Hoor my mooi. Jou lewe gevaar is, dan moet jy loop. Want as enig, want hy het maar nie die titel husband agter sy naam, maar hy stel jou lewe in gevaar. Maar ek kan ook jou lewe in gevaar stel, dat is geen man, dan moet jy ook hardloop, so die dieselfde reël sal geld. It recognized the right of a person to benefit from the fruit of his labor, but prohibit dishonest gain by illegal acquisition, cheating, or embezzlement. That's the one, do not steal. The ninth commandment prohibits making false statements about others in court or otherwise. All forms of slander, defamation, and misrepresentation of individuals or groups are prohibited. Commandment 10 deals with the root of evil actions when it speaks against the greed and desires of the heart. And then you will notice in the last part where it says, now when the people saw the thunder, that's God's revealing to himself. And remember, when God reveals, there's an inward looking immediately. There's the awareness of our sinfulness. And there's almost a discomfort in his presence. That's why they say, you rather speak to us and not God. The book of the covenant, this book, that's from Exodus 20:22 to 23:33. The book includes laws relating to worship, communal and criminal laws, commands and prohibitions introduced by you shall not. And then there's also a conclusion concerned with the mode of the presence of God on the way to Canaan. The mode of the presence of God would refer to the pillar. Yeah, and the fire at night. So let's just take a look at that section there. There's the instruction concerning worship. Here's just an explanation in chapter 20 from 22 to 26, that no idols in worshiping God. Now in Judges, you will find a section, I think it's from chapter 7 onwards, where because the people were doing what was right in their own eyes during that particular period, you'll find that verse often in Judges, you'll find Levites still practicing the religion and the rituals, but they were traveling pastors now, almost. So someone would have a priest in his home now, because there was no meeting anymore in Jerusalem or Shiloh at that time. They were not meeting anymore. So they would have their own little priests in them, and some of them would in fact create a little god and say this is God. But God says no idols. The location of the altar is determined by God, either of earth or unhewn or rope cloth. Soos Pietro vir my geskryf het in hy notes. The meaning of the word altar is place where you slay. The earthen pottery or clay altars would permit the blood of sacrificial animals to drain into the ground. Remember that blood is the life force, as you explained so beautifully. So there was a lot of blood to run out. So we're not allowed to eat it or to consume it. The places of divine manifestation were selected as sites for the altar. Decrees concerning Hebrew slaves. Now, Hebrew slaves may have meant a particular depressed social class. The reason possibly why they ended up that, we really remember most nations looked at the shepherds as an anathema. They did not really want to have them as part of them. The Egyptians, in particular, kept them at a distance. They would have to eat in a separate room and so forth. You would also look at the social classes that came out with in that mixed multitude, also oppressed groups besides the Israelites. An Israelite could become a slave by his father selling him, by selling himself because of poverty or having committed theft. I was trying to think of today how it even looks today, because in a lot of cases we still have slavery. Slavery has, the forms have just changed over the years. Remember in history, because man is the same, it will always repeat itself. The form just change over the years. So servitude, slavery will always exist. Even today with that 20 rand an hour that they get a general worker, you can't live off it. You can't actually live off that money. It's impossible to live off that money. Yet the boss takes home what? Drives his 4x4, has a beautiful home worth 3 million. So slavery still exists, however it's protected by the law. And often Christians overlook these things and don't speak to it really from the pulpit or in civil society. His servitude would be limited to 6 years. The year of Jubilee, which is each 50th year, could further shorten the period it came before the 6th year. So you would be very lucky actually if you became a slave in the 49th year. If married when he became a slave, husband and wife are set free. If he married while enslaved, his wife and children remain the property of the master. Then he can choose if he wants to stay for security's sake and also then to keep the family together with his wife and children. But then he gets the slave and the mark, they literally put him against the door, keeps his ear like that, shoves the awl through it, and possibly puts an earring in it and is marked. And that shows that he would be a servant or a slave for the rest of his life to his master. The ceremony of piercing the ear at the doorpost is an indication of close relationship with the family of the master. So he's literally almost adopted into the family, it seems, from that explanation. In the case of a girl which is sold unconditionally as a slave, she is never freed. A conditional sale of a girl includes the intention of the purchase to marry her or adopt her into the family. And then if she's adopted into the family and she marries one of the sons, she gets the full rights of the daughter-in-law. That's in terms of property ownership. If it's the firstborn, then that blessing, she will reap the rewards there too. Rules for capital offences. A distinction was made between intentional and unintentional. Accidental death by hand of another man. The right of asylum to a sanction provided. Also, if you go into the little laws and stuff like that, you will see that if somebody broke in your vain, you will see who it was. If murder took place then they viewed it differently. Because it was now in the light, you could see what was happening. Because it was evening and you could not see, you had the right then to take him out. Accidental death by hand of another man. In other words, ek het nie bedoel om te gemaak het nie. wat ek doen vir ongeheil en jy sterf af. Then there's the right of asylum to a sanctuary provided. In other words, for example, you often have people coming into our country seeking asylum. They're seeking freedom in another place. Here a place was provided where they could physically go, and that would often be in the towns where the priests were. Remember, the towns had special towns given to them when the land was allocated? And they could run to these places and stay there until the aggressor or the person coming after them decides to leave it alone. Then they would let him go. But he could stay there for life. Deliberately taking a life meant death for the perpetrator. But this is even, I actually forgot about this one. Cursing your mother and father was also punishable by death. And if you look at civil society today, it's incredible what's happening out there.
Scary.
The way we are treating our parents. Rules concerning non-capital offenses. That's why when you read the Old Testament and you're reading the rules, weer eens as ek vroeger verduidelik, jy trek 'n lyn, dis wat die Bybel sê, daar is die wet. Nou, wat gebeur om dit? Want die wet is, die lyn is klaar getrek. En as 'n versagting, en verandering ontstaan met die wat bepaal, die sentence of hoe lang jy gaan sit of whatever. En hier sal jy heeltyd sien hoe dit uitgedeel word. Injuries by men or animals due to negligence, where there is no death, get punished according to the injury type. For example, because of the nature of the way they built their homes in that time. Now, a parapet would be, most of them had, next to the home, there would be the stairway leading to the top of the house. So they built a little wall on the edge, that's a parapet. In other words, you can't fall off. Now, if you did not have a parapet, you would be held accountable. The circumstances would be worse for you. Because you would be negligent, you would be seen as negligent. If negligence can be proven, you will be held accountable. So it's not a case of you not making a case, you still can make the case, because they can prove it, that's it. If a man struck a slave and killed him, the death penalty was excluded from the form of the punishment. Which was an interesting, but I need to go and investigate that. Because as I was reading, I was trying to understand why it did it. Because I remember with Hagar, she was allowed to abuse them. Sorry, but with Sarah, she was allowed to abuse Hagar, but she was not allowed to let her go. She was supposed to still look after and care for her. She was a slave. Injury which was caused by a miscarriage, would be determined by the husband of the slave, and then had to still go to the courts and be approved by the judges. The payment of an eye for an eye was a step forward in the history of punishment because it limited the punishment to the exact equivalent of the crime. Now, I would probably like them to do that today too, because too many people get away with a lot of things. Now, in most cases, we'll be saying sue for damages. That's the procedure. We'll sue for damages, and then depending on how it affects the rest of your life, and whether you can go and work or not, that is possibly how the payout is going to be determined, or the cost is going to be determined. The same rule would also apply, not exactly, but I was thinking of the law of retaliation, what we call retaliation in war. For example, often in the Middle East war with Israel and Palestine, you get Palestine sending in one bomb. Nobody get injured. Israel, 4, 5, 6. That's not an eye for an eye. That is not an eye for an eye. Maar omdat ons moet nou achter Israel staan. Ons dink jy oor dit. If a slave lost an eye or a tooth, it resulted in his freedom. Death by an animal, stoning of animal, or the owner could be ransomed. Now they would either stone the animal, so if one bull gored another bull to death, or a They would stone the animal, or the owner could be ransomed if the relatives of the person caught to a death agreed to it. The price of a slave was set at 30 shekels. Theft and damages. Now, stolen ox were more valuable than sheep. If stolen, an ox there would be fivefold restitution for an ox, fourfold restitution for sheep. And simply because the oxes were also the workhorses at that time, you would plow your field with an ox. Therefore, you would be considered more. You would also be considered more because they had more meat on it.
So the ox had more.
Yeah, much more value than a sheep. If return the thief was to pay double. If the thief was killed if a thief was killed while breaking in at night, the killer was not guilty. If it's during the day, they will obviously go and look at the circumstances. Could he have prevented the killing? Yes or no? If a neighbor's field is grazed or destroyed, in other words, your sheep and whatever come into my land, because there was not enough, there wasn't a boundary wall set, and they eat up all my beautiful grass and stuff, or destroyed by fire, because whether it's intentional or unintentional, if I started the fire somewhere and spread across to his field and burnt up most of his field, then restitution is made by the same person who allowed the grazing of these animals, or that person, or who started the fire with the best of his own land, of course. Rules concerning goods or animals deposited with a neighbor. Sometimes somebody will leave you their home, and they will ask you to look over your home for a couple of weeks while they're on holiday. When taking care of a neighbor's goods during a temporary absence and stolen, the caretaker is fully responsible for the loss. Yes. However, the caretaker may take an oath before the Lord that he did not deceive the owner. Kyk byvoorbeeld in die aand met slaap, jy moes nou nie wat langs aan aangaan. So as het gebeur op tyd wat jy nou nie verantwoordelik gehou word, dit is anders. Then they can't apply the rule in the same way. But that's the rule. You promise to take care of the kids. Yeah. And now there's loss. So they must determine whether you were responsible for that loss. Could you have prevented it, yes or no? If the caretaker was negligent, then partly responsible for the loss, then he makes restitution. Borrowing. The borrower must compensate for the loss of an animal unless the owner was present or the animal was hired. That's self-explanatory. Then you have laws protecting unbetrothed virgins. A man who seduced an unbetrothed virgin must marry the girl and pay the marriage dowry to the father. You remember Tamar?
Tamar, yes.
Yeah, so we have Tamar. That would be similar to that, them coming in and saying, listen, I would like to have, my son would like to marry her. In the case of Tamar, she was raped, she wasn't seduced. That's what made the incident worse. If the father did not approve of the marriage price would serve as a compensation for damage to his property. So he would pay a dowry even though he wouldn't give off his daughter. Sundry prohibitions and commandments. Sorcery, bestiality, and idolatry were punished by death. I mean, nowadays you have, besides the pornography that you have, you also have bestiality movies being spread around. And these guys are getting away with it. No, they're not being held accountable. Resident aliens, widows, orphans, and poor in general are protected by threat of punishment by the sword for those who harm them. And you will see throughout the Bible there's a refrain when it comes to the aliens, the widows, and the orphans. Now, special protection was granted to strangers because of Israel's experience in the land of Egypt. Lending money was for the purpose of helping the poor instead of gaining wealth, and interest was not to be charged at all. There's an interesting verse in Proverbs which says, if you lend money to someone, make sure it's not a stranger, make sure it's someone you know.
And then?
Don't loan to a stranger. You don't know the person, so there's no guarantee. Remember, it's character related. The verse is more related to the character of the person. So if I'm going to loan to her or to you, then it's based on my history with you, our relationship with each other, and the fact that I know you could possibly pay me back. But it's your character first that will determine whether I can whether I will borrow you money or whether you. The neighbor's cloak, accepted as a pledge, was to be returned before sunset to protect the borrower from the cold of the night. Israelites were not to eat flesh of animals which were torn to pieces in the field. I mean, that is obvious because it's a hygienic thing. Die vuilste gedeelte van jou liggaam is met jou mond, in elk geval, so en die se mond is nog erger met daai klomp enzymes wat is daar binne. So hy dra meer kieme in sy mond wat ons miskien dra in ons monde. So justice was not to be perverted by false witnesses, and that relates to this is an explanation of I think this is the seventh commandment. Bribery and neglecting to help enemies were prohibited. Laws protecting the poor you'll find in Exodus 23 verses 1 to 9, and then laws concerning worship again in Exodus 23 10 to 19. Because God is the owner of the soil, it was a reason enough to allow the land to lie every seventh year. You have to look after the land. That's why when they were sent into exile also for 7 years, that related to the fact that they didn't allow the land to rest. So their punishment was in terms of them being disobedient to God over that period of time. And you can imagine how long they didn't obey. The poor could gather and grew voluntary during that year. In other words, they also felt there was other rules also. If you go also into some of the verses, you'll see that when they gathered their grapes or their harvest, whatever, they had to leave part of it over for those who were poor. They actually come into the fields. If they were busy in the harvest, then whatever fell off, they would leave alone. If you look at the story of Ruth, that's what she did. She walked after the harvesters. So whatever fell off, that's what they would gather. The rich could lay up provisions ahead of time for the Sabbath year. The Sabbath was to provide a day of rest for the slaves and animals. 3 feasts were to be observed each year. As you said earlier, the feast, okay, yes, different ones. We're not talking about the same feast. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which you said related to them leaving or departing from Egypt, so very hastily. Unleavened bread would be the better option, it would last longer for them obviously. The Feast of Harvest and the Feast of Ingathering at the end of the year. These were more celebrations of Thanksgiving. Sacrifices and offerings were to be made to the Lord periodically. Leavened bread and sacrificial blood were not to be offered together, lest the leaven ferment and contaminate the blood. That would also relate to a health issue. The Israelite law prohibited the Canaanites from boiling a kid in its mother's milk, which was supposed to ensure fertility. Blessings for keeping the covenant. As long as they do the will of God and worship Him, they would be blessed. The Canaanites would not be driven from the land immediately, but God's occupation would be a gradual process. Boundaries would extend from the Red Sea to the Euphrates. Israel was never to enter into a covenant with the Canaanites or their God. And then lastly, we have the ratification of the covenant. This is in chapter 24, verses 1 to 18. It was a replay now the first one again. Moses, Aaron, and 2 of Aaron's sons, and 70 of the elders of Israel is commanded to approach the mountain of the Lord. But Moses was supposed to alone ascend the mountain. The people, Aaron always had to remain behind to look after the people, while Moses was up there with God. Yet the Lord gives Moses the word, and he turns to the people, and they agree to the requirements of the Lord. Remember, he goes and reads it to them, and then they respond. Moses wrote the words of the law. That's Exodus 24, verse 4. Here it says Moses wrote it, because God speaks. An altar with 12 pillars representing the 12 tribes was built the next morning at the foot of the mountain. And here some young men assisted Moses in the sacrificial service. Half of the blood of the sacrifices was placed on the altar and the other half in basins. And after reading the book of the covenant and giving the people the opportunity to submit to the word of God, Moses sprinkled the blood in the basins on the people. The act shows the relationship of the people to God in the sealing of the covenant. Half of the blood covered the altar, God, and the other half covered the people. After sprinkling the blood over the people and sealing the covenant with the blood, Moses, Aaron's sons, and 70 elders ascended the mountain and saw the glory of the God of Israel. And I God change us. It clergy. Because of his glory, they were able apparently to look only on his feet. The special explanation is given that they beheld God but were unharmed. The ritual symbolized the organic relationship of the people and their God. Here Moses was summoned by the Lord to come up and receive the tablets with the commandments, and Joshua accompanies him. But that is significant